Good afternoon, everyone. We'll just give some more time to allow others that still want to join us to join. At the moment, we already have 95 attendees logged in, so we'll just give it a few more extra minutes. Right, some housekeeping for this this afternoon session. So if you want to have a look, then we recommend that you position the speaker, me, in the top right hand corner around the orange box, so you can see all the slides. So I made sure that most slides have no information in that corner. Use the chat function to send messages rather than raising your hand. And alternatively, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function. While we go through this, have a look at the first question in the polling session. We asked to have a look at question 1, and would appreciate it if you could answer them. So we do have a Q&A function at the end. We allow you to vote for the questions that you may raise and rate them. We will do 2 polls, one at the beginning and we'll do 1 at the end. And then, of course, the webinar will be recorded and you will be emailed a link to it. It will be available to members of the OR Society and non-members for a limited period. But you will see that in the email that will be sent to you. You'll also receive a survey tomorrow, and we ask you if you could be so kind to share the feedback with us when you return that questionnaire as soon as you can. So we leave this open for a few more minutes and see whether more people want to join us. So thank you for voting. That looks really good, really interesting. Confirms a good spread of experience. Someone raised the issue that my microphone might be a bit muffled. We did do a test and it sounded all clear. Not entirely sure what the technical issues are. Excellent. Thanks, Bob, for the tip. I'll try to speak as loudly as I can. And Tati can share the results of the poll with you so that you all get the same sort of view of the results. So anyone else who has just joined us, please look at the housekeeping rules and make sure that those tips and suggestions will work for you, and we'll make a start. So welcome everyone. My name is Kees Van Haperen. I've been asked to give you an introduction on soft systems methodology, and that will be the topic of today's presentation. I will try to cover different elements and place soft systems methodology into some form of context and show a number of different steps. I've seen some names appearing here, and say hello to Giles. Giles has been one of those experienced soft systems methodology practitioners as well, and I know he has particular views, and we share quite a lot of that. So hopefully he may also be able to pick up some questions that you might have later on. I'm a practitioner by nature. I have a part-time or a visiting academic connection. I've been a consultant with a number of small, medium enterprise consultancies over the past 20 years, applied SSM in a range of different projects and environments. I've also worked for some larger engineering consultancies and management consultancies, where I have also been able to apply some of this, but in a slightly different way to what I used to do as part of a small consultancy. So I'll share with you my experience and my views and my insights as I see them as a consultant. That might be different from those that are academics or have an academic perspective on this. I'm clearly coming from a practitioner's point of view, and that's therefore the caveat around which I base around my experience and practitioner. The webinar is based on the book that Brian Wilson and I published already 5 years ago. We made the launch at Euro conference in Glasgow 5 years ago. So a lot of the material is based on that book, and you might be able to find that. Of course, there are other brands of books. Those of you who've heard about soft systems methodology already may, of course, know Peter Jackland as the man that created the fame around SSM. He joined the Lancaster department about 3 years into the program, where Brian Wilson was running the Action Research Program and he was effectively the managing director of the consultancy that gave rise to the practice that was needed to further insight and knowledge. And I've worked for many years with Brian, who's now more or less retired, and I think Peter is in a similar sort of position. I think the difference between Peter's publications and also those in partnership with those three names, Jim Scholes, Sue Holber, and John Poulter, is that Brian's clearly been focused on applying this in larger environments, and the modeling is a bit more methodical and really focused on big challenging programs and organizational change projects. So this is just a caveat to say you can find other books, and we'll make a start in earnest. So what I hope you may be able to achieve, for those of you that have not had any experience yet or may have known about this, it gives you a little bit of appreciation of the relevant and critical role of soft systems thinking, and understand some of the basic principles. There's only so much we can do in an hour, so it's really making an introduction, giving an introduction, and hopefully enticing you to do a bit more research. Maybe contact me after the session if you want to know more. I'm happy to help. It's particularly been of use in my work context, in those environments that are complex, where we have to deal with multiple stakeholders and deal with organizational change and transformation opportunities and environments. So hopefully that's what we will achieve today. I will set a background, give you a bit of background, set the context, talk about the approach to SSM as it's been explained in some of these publications I showed you earlier, and then a little bit of reflection, and then we open the floor to questions. I tend to have more slides than time, so I may skip over some of the slides. I will make the slide pack available as a PDF, so for you to download and for you to use as you see fit. So soft systems methodology evolved through an action research program at Lancaster University, really starting in the late 1960s, and Brian was one of the first that joined that department. He's the only surviving member of that original founding activities, and it was a reaction against the traditional management science. The view there was that realities can be objective, neutral, and value-free, and there was really a focus on trying to see whether they could apply system engineering and systems analysis types approaches to organizational settings. The program very early on proved that that was not as easy, and really it didn't help at all. So contrary to what the beliefs were, and that some of the emerging systems ideas could be applied in that context. And remember, the 60s, we talk about post-Second World War developments, where a lot of the original operational research, operational analysis was a bit harder focus and started to shape in that post-war environment. So this was the first time that there was a real thinking and a realization that that sort of harder approach didn't work. And therefore there was something else required. And it became acknowledged that the context is a soft context. So let me explain what soft means in soft systems methodology. It acknowledges that problems do not just exist independently of the observers, but that they are constructs of a concerned mind, a person who has, or people, in a plural, that have particular concerns about a particular problem or problematic situation. Different people have different appreciations of problem situations because they generally see them in different ways. And just as problems are intellectual constructs, so are the solutions to those problems. Whereas the hard context says there is only one answer to that problem. The softer context acknowledges that there might be more than one answer to a particular problem based on your particular worldview. As a thinker, when you look at such problem constructs, there are two prevailing views. One is referred to as an ontologist, an observer here mentioned and named O, who sees the world in a particular way, and he says the world is the way that he perceives that, whereas an epistemologist recognizes the world may be described in many different ways, of which O's view is one particular way of describing that world. So here I'm starting to lay a foundation for understanding the difference between a hard and a soft view. So the softer is the epistemologist perspective. The concept of a problem, traditionally was looked at as a perceived mismatch between a desired and actual state. But that's inadequate for describing many of the difficulties that arise within organizations, or as we refer to them, human systems. And we tend to describe those as messes or problematic situations because they are complex in a particular manner. So improvement in problem situations are most likely to be brought about through the sharing of these perceptions and a process of persuasion and debate between the individuals involved or with a stake in resolving such issues. Here's a quick overview. You may recall a hard approach is based on the acknowledgement that phenomena obey physical laws. We can repeat the process of solving the problems because we can apply the same process and the same way of tackling those problems using, for instance, mathematics. However, soft individual perceptions cannot be ignored. Processes can be represented by using the concept of human activity systems, and different individuals will have different perceptions of what is actually happening or what needs to happen to resolve those issues. So that's in brief the context of soft. Now let's have a look at what we mean by systems thinking. And regrettably, the word systems thinking or the term systems thinking is nowadays often used in a very different or broad context. We could argue that it's better to use some thinking based on system thinking, but that thinking, it would be really good if the thinking is holistically and that we can look at things in a holistic manner, and therefore there is this conviction that systems thinking must be a good thing. However, we tend to use systems as in a different context. Systems is really used as an adjective to describe the terms in which the thinking has to be done. The misuse of the term then comes because we try to use the adjective to describe some aspect of the real world instead of describing the thinking. So we're using systems concepts to think about, to develop some form of concept or intellectual construct to help us tackle and understand the real world, make sense of it. So systems thinking then is to describe that set of concepts in use rather than the description of reality. So we make that distinction. And I think that's important to remember. In what I'm talking about today, the thinking is based on the use of concepts or intellectual constructs that we use to make sense to some issue that exists within the real world. And that's the systems thinking element. If we combine that with the soft part, the soft systems thinking, then we're using concepts that are based or recognize and acknowledge that different individuals may have different perceptions. But here's a real world example. We can look at the London Underground. Most of you may have had an opportunity to travel around London and use the London Underground. And here is the complexity that is shown of the technical aspects of that London Underground, with people, with tracks, with stations, with all sorts of issues. But you may all remember that there's some form of depiction of that London Underground, which originally was known as a diagram, but now we know that as a map of the London Underground. Of course, that map is a simplified and clear representation of the London Underground, but that doesn't exist in reality. It's a construct to help us make sense of that London Underground. It's not a representation of the business of the London Underground, but it's the physical system that represents the London Underground, for which that business called London Underground is responsible. So this is just the first clear example on how we can use that systems thinking and use those maps. But of course, this is not an example or a representation of the soft component. So what do we mean by soft systems methodology? Well, really, it's a structured way to establish a learning system for investigating messy problems. It's a methodology that aims to bring about improvement in areas of social concern by triggering in the people that are involved in that situation some form of a learning cycle, ideally never ending. So it's very similar to what Peter Senge referred to as a learning organization. We embark on a process of constantly trying to improve the situation, reflect on this, involve people that have a stake in this particular problematic situation. Learning takes place through the iterative process of using those systems concepts and then reflect upon and debate perceptions of the real world that we try to map onto these concepts, and then taking action in the real world and then again reflect on the happenings using systems concepts. And I'll give you some examples to make this a bit less theoretical and make it a bit more tangible. So the reflection and debate is structured by a number of systemic models, and I'll talk about those in a minute. These are concerned as holistic, ideal types of certain aspects of the problem situation rather than accounts of it. So the models that we're using are relevant to solving the problem. They are not representations of the problem or of the organization. They're relevant to tackle the issues that we are encountering. The premise is that there's no objective, complete account of a problem that can be given, but we use those concepts to reflect on them and to study and understand them. So if we look at reality, and I said, I've been using this in the context of complexity, where things are complex and messy, and reality contains people, which often means that what we're looking at is makes each situation unique. However, what is common to all these particular aspects is that the people together do not act randomly. They act together to follow some form of purpose. They pursue purposeful activity. Therefore, if we could model that purposeful activity in some way or another and use that as a way to start thinking about that reality, then we might be able to make sense of that complexity, the messiness, and how different people interact and respond to situations. So such models that we then refer to are known as human activity models or human activity systems. We define some form of statement of purpose, also known as root definition, which is the technical term used in SSM. And then we use logic, the logic of the analyst or the person that is doing an intervention into the problematic situation, to convert that statement into conceptual models that define what has to be done to achieve the stated purpose. Human activity system consists of activities, and they're defined by using verbs in the imperative. So that's the modeling language. It's a simple language. It's the English language, verbs in the imperative, and then we demonstrate or we show and understand the logical dependencies between these activities. Those activities together are then governed through monitoring and control activities to ensure that the whole is adaptive and survives in the changing environment. and activities can then be analyzed to define the information that is required to do these or produced by these activities, and look at activities and the subsystems that are formed by activities to define measures of performance. So what we've got here is information relevant to the conceptual model and measures of performance relevant to the conceptual model. So a very powerful framework for analysis emerges. It's that framework then that we use to reflect on reality and explore that, to try to find improvements in the real world. It's important to note, though, that purposeful activity will be viewed differently by different people. So there is no single answer. It's a one particular view in which we're applying soft systems. It's not always the best approach, and my personal experience is that suitability is high when management and their operational staff are viewed as stakeholders, and when their ownership of improvements is seen as an essential prerequisite for change. We can't use this, as often is thought, by mandating or ordering some form of change, and for a particular senior individual hide behind the process. I have had occasionally an individual that was either trying to or was skilled at achieving that and almost feigned some sort of interactive process. But really, this is about some form of action learning and organizational development, and they need to be parallel and interconnected processes. It is about trying to improve the organization. But as I said, not always the best approach, but it works in this sort of environment that is complex. And if you look at Michael Pitt from Lancaster, he came up with a particular spectrum, a problem spectrum against which he reflected and created a system modeling spectrum. And we're looking with SSM in the area where problems are complex, where we talk about messes and wicked problems, and the particular tool for thinking represents insight for debate. Whereas at the other end of the scale, we're talking about puzzles. We're talking about different kinds of maybe harder approaches where we could use tools for routine decision making. We can automate some of it. And this is where we start talking about simulations, for instance. So reflecting on that spectrum, SSM matches well with the problems that involve messes and wicked problems, complex problems. Mike Jackson came up with a systems of systems approach, looking at the different way of structuring such problems and using systems-based methods, and came with the suggestion that when we have divergent values and interests, so let me say that there are, for instance, different individuals within an organization, we can assume that those individuals within the organization may share some view of purpose. They are all working together in one organization to achieve the purpose of the organization. So we have, although we have a pluralist view, there may be different individuals with different viewpoints, we probably agree that we're going to agree at some stage when we have different views. In that sort of context, SSM clearly focused on the why we're doing this and what is it that we need to do to achieve the purpose, sits in that kind of environment. Other slightly harder approaches may sit in a unitary environment where we're more looking at a functionalist perspective. We're looking at how we're doing things or how much we want to achieve. Whereas at the other end of the scale, emancipators such as critical system heuristics are methods that look at bringing together people with different viewpoints that are probably never going to agree and will continue to disagree. For instance, environmental groups that disagree with a new runway at Heathrow. Bringing together those groups is unlikely to result in some form of consensus and a unitary perspective. So different approaches are probably more useful. And I recommend the critical system heuristics as one of those approaches there. So that's where SSM resides, in that space, together with a few others as cognitive mapping. And at the OR conference, Colin Eden and Fran Ackerman will talk a little bit more about SODA and cognitive mapping. So have a look at those presentations during the OR conference. So let's look then, now having created the context and the background for SSM, look at some more methodological issues or steps and how we break down SSM in different elements. Jekyll and Winter came up with the fact that we have 4 ways of gaining insight using soft systems methodology. The first one is to represent the situation in rich pictures, and many of you might already know about rich pictures, maybe not in an SSM context, but it has now become a recognized and well accepted tool to create a picture of a total situation, a holistic perspective. We can then look at carrying out different forms of analysis. We can look at the social characteristics in a particular situation, referred to as analysis 2. We can carry out a disposition of power, acknowledging that different individuals may have certain power positions within the organization, and we refer to that as analysis 3. Or carry out analysis of the intervention itself, which we refer to as analysis 1. So 4 different perspectives, and at the end I'll show you an overview of how you may want to undertake soft systems methodology, and it flags up those different types of analysis that you may want to carry out as part of an intervention. So 4 different ways of gaining insight. Very soon, at some stage, Jacqueline concluded that talking about SSM as sort of a cyclical process may not be particularly helpful if you have a starting point and an end point in mind. SSM in use really requires constant attention to and reflection on cultural aspects of that situation of concern, and therefore a representation was developed that gave equal weight to, let's call it the cultural analysis, the social elements of the analysis, versus a more logic-based stream, which is all to do with doing the systems modeling and developing conceptual models. And I will talk briefly about each of those streams in slightly more detail. The 2 streams must be considered or work together. Some of the cultural elements of the stream are less developed, and a lot has happened within sociology and within anthropology and management science, that there are far better approaches now available, far richer approaches to address these particular aspects. And I'm not sure that SSM gives really good guidance on how to go about doing this. But I think the important part is that you acknowledge that we need to address the cultural and social and power related aspects in the analysis. But I recommend that you may explore some of the other approaches. For instance, Johnson Scholes that came up with the cultural web, for instance. So let's make let's spend a bit more time on each of the forms of analysis. Analysis 1, the first part is the intervention of role analysis. We're thinking of an investigation into problematic, pardon me, we'll recap. Thinking of an investigation into a particular problematic situation itself is problematical, particularly when we're dealing with complexity and when we bring different people together, we start by disagreeing what we're disagreeing on. So we can think about the intervention structurally as entailing 3 main roles. First of all, the client. The client is the person causing the study or the investigation to take place. And it is worthwhile to consider what that client's ideas and thoughts are with regards to the study or the engagement that we're putting together or intervention. A problem solver or a practitioner, which might be the soft systems methodology practitioner, might apply soft systems methodology to tackle a particular problem. And then a problem owner. The owner is the person has a stake in the issues that need to be addressed. And sometimes the owner and the client could be the same person, and then we separate client problem owner versus problem solver. Very often in procurement activities, the problem owner may be the person that has the real issue, whereas the client is the one that pays for resolution of the particular challenge and brings in an external problem solver or practitioner as a consultant or internally as a business analyst that may fulfill that particular role. Analysis 2 is then looking at the social system aspect and looks at the interaction between roles, norms, and values. So this is an SSM's simple model. If you look at Peter Checklin's first book on soft systems methodology, he highlights this and provides more detail around this. This is where I say there are probably other concepts that are, since the 60s, 70s, that are explored the issues in a greater level of detail. and I recommend you explore that. Analysis 3 is then how power is expressed within the particular situation. And actually SSM doesn't provide much guidance on how to tackle this and how to address this properly. Yet if you, for instance, look at crystal system heuristics, there's a greater insight in how to deal with this as the emancipatory approach that I reflected on earlier. So those are the 3 forms of analysis as part of the stream of cultural analysis. Let's now look at the logic-driven stream of inquiry. And this is probably closer to the modeler's heart. And it talks about the different relevant systems that we think about or that we create that reflect particular problematic issues that we're looking at. Those relevant systems, we try to define statements of purpose, develop models of them, and we then use those models to compare against the situation. We try to identify differences between the models in the real world and then identify changes that are systemically desirable and culturally feasible in order for us to take action to improve the situation. That's at heart, in essence, the logic-based stream of analysis. What we're doing is we're creating rich pictures, we're defining root definitions or statements of purpose, develop conceptual models based on those root definitions, and then look at possible changes that are both desirable and feasible, and developing the actions to bring about those changes. So that's the logic stream. Sometimes we can depict that logic stream as a 7-stage process. This was quite early on in Peter's writing around SSM. He came up with this model. Then later on, he felt that this model was not entirely appropriate. I think it helps well to articulate and explain what SSM is about and how you could apply it, as long as you bear in mind that you could start anywhere in the cycle. However, logically, if you start tackling a particular problematic situation, you would start with one when the problem situation in your mind and in the mind of the stakeholders is still unstructured. We don't know what might be going on. We then try to express that in a particular way. And rich pictures form one of those ways to start expressing that situation. The blue dotted line here is the line that we use to make a distinction between the top part, the real world, versus the systems thinking about that real world. So we now move from the real world, now have expressed that particular problem situation using a rich picture, into using root definitions, defining root definitions for systems that may be relevant to that particular situation. We use a mnemonic, and I'll explain that in a bit more detail later on. We convert those into conceptual models. We may use some techniques to elaborate these or to verify that the model has been developed correctly. Then undertake a comparison with reality, desirable feasible changes, and action to improve the situation. And ideally, as I said earlier on, that learning process is iterative. It will continue and new problems emerge, and we try to make sense of them again and again. Let me give you some examples going through each of these stages. So problematic situation, unstructured, we're really talking about collating information if we engage with the situation. Maybe look at organizational reports and accounts, internally published background material, studies, audit report. There may be some semi-structured interviews, some raw data that we bring together. But what we don't do at this stage is actually analyze any of it. During the next stage, stage 2, we may analyze the situation and start to convert our understanding pictorially. I am a person that may use the rich picture to really try to explain my thinking. So the rich picture is my understanding, is a conversion of my understanding to something that I can share with the stakeholders, those individuals that have a stake in a particular problem. There are others that use a collaborative process with the stakeholders to create this, and even go further than that. We may actually ask the individual stakeholders to create their own pictures of the particular situation. I'm using it as a way to make my process transparent, my thinking transparent. I try to use as much as I can the language of the stakeholders, the language of the client, and I try not to convert language into what I think is the appropriate language. I try to make that picture depict the situation as the stakeholders see this, but it's my interpretation of that. You may sometimes need to put a legend together to explain any sort of codes or statements or depictions that you use within that picture. A rich picture. We then start thinking about statement of purpose, and we use a mnemonic called CATWOE. The CATWOE mnemonic stands for customer, actor, owner, environmental constraints, and importantly, the heart of the CATWOE is based on the T and the W. It's systems thinking, where a system is something that transforms something, and in systems language, it transforms an input into some form of output. So the transformation is the component that helps us to define the core essence, the core purpose of what we're talking about. But we also build in a particular perception that individuals may have. And W is a term borrowed from psychology, Weltanschauung, that provides meaning to the transformation process. It's our belief system. It explains what makes T meaningful. In this context, I often use an example to do with prisons. Different individuals may have different viewpoints of what a prison is. A prison may be seen as something that rehabilitates individuals. It may be seen as something that punishes criminals. It may be a school for criminals to become better criminals. It's our belief that a prison has a particular purpose to achieve something based on that belief. It either punishes, or it's secure, or it's to do with rehabilitation. It's a bit of a challenge to get your head around what it means, and I won't spend too much time. Normally, when I do an SSM course or an introduction, we'll try to make it interactive and encourage you to do stuff. You need to do this to really feel comfortable to go in the right direction with this and make this approach work for you. For now, it suffices to say that the root definition or the statement of purpose consists of all those elements. You may occasionally lose an element if you believe that it's not relevant or not helpful, but you may never lose the T and the W. The T and W are required together to create a statement of purpose. Let me give you an example. So here's a root definition related to children's services, and it's a full paragraph where we have all the different components that I just talked about represented within that paragraph of text. The CATWOE is organized in this way, so the transformation here is to improve quality of life of children that are struggling, that have issues, and need some form of service. This was related to a project in Thameside to do with children's services. So we try to improve quality of life for them. We have selected members of the 0 to 24-year-old young people within a particular county or district, and it's about providing a series of services that are provided by service suppliers. Constraint is available finance, the community owns this, and our belief is that if seeking to influence and bring about change in behavior, we will be able to improve the quality of life of selected members. So that's the W part. We turn that into a model. I can't show you the entire bit, but I have included a model that depicts that, reflects that particular conceptual model, root definition. We've broken those activities down into subsystems, 1, 2, etc. And they depict the root definition, the various elements of that. Let me make it a bit simpler rather than this may be a bit overwhelming for those that have never seen this before. If we look at the situation, Thameside, 0 to 24-year-olds, they have particular service needs, and there are a series of support providers. Organizationally complex because it involved over 20 organizations to do with education, the police, social services, works and pensions, etc. Socially complex situation, high degree of uncertainty, multi-agency, not talking the same language. The purpose of what we're doing here is that we try to transform children with social deprivation into children with improved quality of life. And we can do that by applying this simple soft systems model that then depicts that particular statement of purpose. We need to identify those children. We need to determine the nature of the deprivation. We need to define services that then address that deprivation and provide those services. We talk about quality of life without knowing what it means. So we also need to define what we mean by quality of life. And we believe that by doing this, we will improve quality of life of those young people. So we need to assess the contribution of those services to quality of life. And now we have a subsystem, a conceptual model in a language of what it is that you need to do to achieve that purpose that I showed you earlier on. So this is in a very simple way, the way that we use soft systems methodology to create a concept. We then life and we start asking questions. Are we doing this? Who's doing it? Are we doing this well? What information do we need? And this was then used to create a common information model between those different multi-agency organizations that were involved in assessing in a children assessment framework. How can it fail? Well, we can think about how that transformation needs to take place. And in SSM, we refer to what could fail and asking that question. And what we in effect are defining are measures of performance. So the three ways in which it can fail is that it's not effective, that it's not efficacious, i.e. it doesn't do what it needs to do, or it's not efficient, i.e. we consume too many resources to bring this about. So in SSM, that's referred to as measures of performance, efficacy, efficiency, and effectiveness, E1, E2, E3. Some people use some more, but I think the most objective, rational measures are those three, whereas ethicality and elegance are a bit more subjective. What does that mean? Let me give you an example. So if I use the example of providing access to a customer's bank account, then I can ask information. What is it that I need to know to be able to do that? And here are a number of different bits of information that talk about what it is that I'm seeking to do. I can measure this in terms of the provision, the access provision. So I can then look at that in terms of the degree of accessibility. I can look at it at the total cost, so an efficiency measure, and I can look at it in the degree of security of access, which is a quality measure. These then become the performance measures related to do with providing access. So it's that provision that we're measuring here, rather than the customer's account. It's the provision or the provision of access that we're measuring. Those measures of performance then help us to start thinking about how we achieve that. And the what is to provide access, the how is to do with the cashier or a cash machine or telephone banking and the use of the internet. And these particular hows can be measured in terms of those measures of performance. So a cashier has a high degree of accessibility, but not 24/7. Yet the cash machine can provide access 24/7, but is expensive. The use of the internet is constantly, but the degree of security may be a bit more problematic. So here are then a number of examples where we could look at an activity, we can look at the information input, the information that it creates, and the measures of performance applicable to that. Together, that forms a very powerful, rich framework that we use to do analysis in the real world. So we use these models then to do comparison in reality. And here's an example on how we use that and what we seek to achieve. Comparison can happen through informal discussions, formal questioning, scenario writing, or trying to model the real world in the same structure as the conceptual models. You are pretty free in how you go about doing that. And taking action is then ultimately the next step. We also talk about modes. I will skip that and leave that for you to read. A bit of reflection. What have I talked about? So I've talked about SSM in a particular way, and Norton came up with 5 constitutive rules to sort of give a real overview on what we're doing with SSM and how you may want to apply that. So SSM is a structured way of thinking, which focuses on improvement in some problematic real-world situation. Structured thinking based on systems ideas and try to create things that are depict a human activity system for which we define a purpose that then gets converted into a conceptual model of activities needed to realize that purpose. Claim that SSM has been used in some instance should be based on one of the following. No automatic assumption that the world is systemic. We actually argue the opposite. The world's chaotic, it's messy, it's complex. You need to make a distinction between the real world and systems thinking about the real world. So we apply the concepts. Systems thinking involves the construction of holons, a whole perspective, taking the form of human activity systems which embody the four basic systems ideas. It has emergent property, it has a layered structure, hierarchical or layered. Yeah. Small systems form part of larger systems, so we may have a wider system of interest that within them have narrower systems of interest or subsystems. There's some form of process of communication and control. For those of you that know, that resembles very much the essence of cybernetic thinking or feedback control mechanisms in control theory. And then we're about desirable and feasible change, defined by comparison of those holons, the human activity systems, with the real world. Any potential use of SSM should be preceded by conscious thought, how to adapt it, and SSM is a methodology, and every use of that methodology may yield methodological lessons, so you need to do some reflection. Here's a process that shows you how you could apply SSM in a particular situation. You need to decide what it is that you're faced with, what you're looking at, and then start to build up your analysis 2 and analysis 3, and then start undertaking the analysis 1. Build the pictures of the situation, rich pictures, start developing statements of purpose, build conceptual models, do the comparison, etc. We've added some perspectives there because, I'll return to the previous slide, because Brian Wilson came up with some additional steps when you want to do information-based analysis. We talked about monitoring and control and defining those criteria for monitoring and control, and then reflection on the approach itself. I talked about stages. Here you can see the outputs of those stages, rich pictures of relevant systems, root definitions, etc. So these are the particular outputs of each of the individual stages that make up SSM. Some techniques and terms that I've used, so these are really for you to look back on the things that I've talked about, and this may be useful for you if you want to reflect quickly on the particular elements that make up SSM and the language we use. And then finally, change, defensibility, and complexity. So in summary, I didn't talk about these separately, but I talked about complexity. But really what the thinking and applying of SSM in those contexts is about is that we cannot state with any certainty what the organization or organizational unit is or could be. We need to think about that, and SSM helps us to do that. Organizations tend to be structured arbitrarily, so with SSM and looking at and applying that on an organization, we ignore the organization itself. All organizations are in transition. There's already some form of change happening. So when we start, it's not a blank canvas we can start with. We probably need to accept that there are already people there, that the organization is already doing things. Any analysis which is related to a specific organization must account for the multiple perceptions of the people making up that organization. And I think by talking about transformations and worldviews, I've started to highlight that SSM takes those different perceptions into account. The two essential elements, SSM talks about what terms, uses terms in the context of what it is that we're seeking to achieve rather than how. And that distinction, what and how, I use the bank accounts example for. It's an important distinction. Don't stare yourself blind on how things are done or need to be done. That is what comes out of the analysis. And it's about making a real distinction between the real world and system thinking. And then finally, in evaluating the approach, have we done this well or have we done this poorly? It is quite a challenge to do that. But two things that you need to take into account. A, the domain in which we do this approach, adopt this approach, and the way in which we use the approach. Jacqueline said, if you tried and it worked, could you have used an ad hoc approach? So really, do we know that this was due to SSM? Or if we did this and it does or it did not work, how did we know that that was due to SSM? Or was it just because the poor result that we have created was due to our own incompetence? So it's an interesting pointing questions. Connell came up with the realization that SSM tries to bring about change. So some of that is to do with how well the stakeholders participate. So we may be able to say something about the process in terms of the participation of stakeholders. or the success that we achieved. What level of change did we bring about? Or did we just achieve some insights rather than achieve change? And he came up with a success matrix. So it's not easy to evaluate this, but soft approaches can't be repeated to get a better result. Soft approaches are about a process of engaging stakeholders and adapt and learn about the problematic situation. And it's about the learning that we achieve. So that's the slide component part. We'll now ask you to have a look at question 2, and we open the floor to any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Kees. So we've had quite a few questions coming, and Giles has actually been helping you with the answers. So if you want to open your Q&A and have a look, and I'll read the questions to you, and then you can, if you want to add any more to Giles's answer. So the first question is, could you tell us more about rich pictures, perhaps giving an example?
I included an example in the slide pack, so I don't know whether this question was asked before or after that example, but there are quite a lot of rich picture examples online. I use one to do with a pub, and when you search for that online, you get a view of a pub and the wider environment. Rich pictures really try to depict anything of concern within a particular problematic situation. The people, processes, and I think that's all we try to do with the rich picture, a depiction of what is going on in essence. When I teach it, when I stand in front of a group of people, there are still a lot of people that like to write things down, so they come up with lots of words. That's not what a rich picture is about. Try to convert it pictorially. It's not a drawing competition, so have a go at it. It's just to help you resolve your lack of insight and gain some form of understanding. So hopefully that answers that question.
Thank you. And the next question from Alistair is, could you recommend a guide for applying SSM, preferably a digestible document, not necessarily a big textbook?
Yeah, of course I ought to advertise Brian and my own, but that was maybe a bit too much. But Chaplin and Poulter came up with a slightly thinner booklet. But I'm quite happy to engage with Alistair after this session and give him a few pages that may help him to start and have a go at this himself.
Thank you. Okay, and the next question from Stephen. On the 7-step activities, could you give an example of how we compare the conceptual model and the real world?
Yeah, so the conceptual model, effectively, let me see whether I can I'll just stop presenting this one and show something else that may be useful. Well, let me just answer the question simplistically. So the conceptual model, once you've got activities in your conceptual model, those activities are like the set of questions. So provide access to the bank account, that's an activity. We can then say, who's responsible for that? Who's doing it? What do we call it? What's the name of it? So really, the model gives you the set of questions that you want to ask or want to reflect upon with the stakeholders and start to map out how things are done. Your measures of performance then give you a way of measuring how things are being done. So if the measure is to do with cost of access, so an efficiency measure, we can then say, how much does it cost us to do this? Oh, there are 3 houses. We do this through telephone banking. We do this through a slot machine outside of the bank, and we do this through a person, and we can calculate the cost of each individually. Is that problematic is then the question. Are we doing that well, or are there issues with it? And we start to map out what is going wrong with it or what is going well with it, because we also want to learn from the things that are going well. So that's a way to use that conceptual model to create your own questionnaire based on the activities within that model. What you now know compared to other methods is that you've got all the questions that you may need to ask, and you know how they relate to other elements within your conceptual model.
Thank you. So the next question from Giles. This is arguable. Chaplin took a critical realist position later, but the books always stress the interpretive position. Personally, I feel SSM fits nicely with hard approaches. And
I agree. I don't disagree with that. I think if we look at what SSM allows you to do, and it gives you an understanding of the context, it can help you to create insight into what the problematic situation is and what the purpose is that we seek to pursue, and develop a conceptual model for that to understand that. It's then a very simple step to look at each of these activities in a harder fashion. And I've used other approaches in combination with SSM, so that's more of a problem structuring method type approach, for instance, looking at system dynamics or looking at viable systems model, or simplistically going into IT design, where we use things like unified modeling language and start to use harder approaches to designing IT systems.
Thank you. And Natalia, sorry, I just lost it. Natalia's asked, could you please recommend the reading on this, as she's interested in SSM application from the perspective of the critical realist. Yep, sorry.
Yeah, so, well, I think one of the first book of Peter Jackland is a good starting point. It's a good reading book. Maybe Giles may have some other information, some papers. Peter's books. Peter has also written the same sort of paper many times over, and you can find them online. You don't need to buy the book for that, but I can recommend that to give a slightly more philosophical perspective on soft systems.
Thank you. And Matthew's asked, do you know of any examples of combining SSM with more hard system sorry, can't get the word out, analysis, and can they work together well?
As I mentioned earlier, yes, they can work well. If SSM gives you the insight as to what it is that you're trying to achieve, or what it is that you need to do to realize the purpose, you can start to map the real systems that are in use, or design the systems that you want to implement, for instance, IT systems, or if we want to do fault analysis in an engineering type context, you can combine that very easily. You now know what those harder systems support or enable, the way that you define that within in the software environment.
Thank you. And Ian's asked, on problem structuring methods, where would the strategic choice approach and approaches like wargaming and matrix games fit in?
So wargaming and matrix games, they're not necessarily clear as to what it is that you try to wargame or matrix. So that's a type of scenario-based approach. I think it depends on what it is that you try to do. Strategic choice approach sits in the same area as SSM and SODA. Yeah, I think they would fall in the interpretive middle on the Jackson model. That's where that would fit.
Okay, I think we're out of time, so I don't think we'll be able to get any more questions during this session.
Yeah, may I say something to Eleanor? She asks me and Giles whether we have any tips for online teaching of subjects like SSM. Mm-hmm. Well, the online tip is that teaching SSM is about doing it. So online is a bit of a challenge unless you bring a group of people together virtually and you've got the techniques of a virtual whiteboard or some form of sharing what you write and talk about together. So it's a collaborative endeavor. If you have the technology online to do that collaboratively, then I think it's great. I think this webinar was intended to create a bit of an appetite and an insight into further exploration and further questions. I would really recommend that people try it and play with it. And yeah, it's like swimming or cycling. You have to do it and you have to fall off to be better at it. My first modeling experience was very much like that. I modeled the wrong systems and did it with a colleague, and together we made lots of mistakes, but we learned from those mistakes. You can't read that in a book. You really need to do it yourself. And that's my recommendation in virtual online teaching. Try to create a collaborative environment where you can do that.
Thank you, Kees. So any unanswered questions, I will share them with Kees so that he can come back to you via email. So we have got a record of all the unanswered questions. So I'd just like to say thank you to everyone for joining. Kees?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you all very much. I hope you have enjoyed it. I look forward to your answers to the poll, the second poll, and hopefully, yeah, don't hesitate to contact me. You've got my email address. I promise to answer all emails you send me, and we'll look at that. I will look at that and come back to you as soon as I can. Thank you all. And thank you, Tati, for facilitating.
You're welcome. I'll just leave the poll running for a few seconds to allow people to answer.
Thank you.
You would like me to, I'll wait for it to slow down a little bit and then I'll share the results. Okay, I'll share the results now. So I think Kees will need to provide a bit more information going forward. Something that we can work on.
Yeah, thank you. I look forward to that.
Yeah. All right, brilliant. So I'm going to end the session now. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye.